Elderly woman believes cat is dead after Oregon tsunami. Then she sees this. The salt-laced wind whipped Agnes's gray hair across her face as she stood on the porch, her gaze fixed on the churning Pacific. The sky, usually a cheerful Oregon blue, was a bruised, ominous purple, mirroring the unsettling unease that had settled in her stomach. She'd lived on this stretch of the coast, in the small town of Seabreeze, her entire 78 years, and she'd seen her share of storms. But this felt different. "Marmalade," she called, her voice thin against the rising wind. Her ginger cat, a creature of habit and comfort, was usually sunning himself on the porch railing this time of day. "Marmalade, supper time." A low rumble, like distant thunder, brat through the floorboards beneath her feet. The sea, a restless gray giant, was drawing back, exposing stretches of seabed she'd never seen before. It was an eerie, unnatural sight, a silent scream before the roar. Agnes felt a prickle of fear. She remembered the stories her grandfather, a fisherman, used to tell, tales of the ocean's unpredictable fury. He'd spoken of waves that could swallow towns whole, born from earthquakes far out at sea. "Marmalade." Her voice was sharper now, edged with panic. She stepped off the porch, her arthritic knees protesting, and scanned the small yard. Her weathered clapboard house, painted a cheerful yellow that was now fading under the darkening sky, stood perched on a slight rise, offering a panoramic view of the ocean. It was a view she usually cherished, but today, it filled her with dread. The rumble grew louder, morphing into a deafening roar. Agnes turned back to the sea, her heart hammering against her ribs. A wall of water, impossibly high, was racing towards the shore. It was a monstrous, churning beast, its crest frothing white against the dark sky. "Dear God," she whispered, the words ripped away by the wind. Instinct took over. She scrambled back towards the house, her mind screaming at her to run, to get to higher ground. She had to find Marmalade. She burst through the front door, calling his name. The house was filled with the familiar sense of lavender and lemon, a comforting contrast to the terror building outside. She checked his usual spots: the worn armchair by the fireplace, the sunny windowsill in the kitchen, the soft rug in her bedroom. He was nowhere. The roar was deafening now. The windows rattled in their frames. Agnes knew she couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her emergency bag, a small backpack she kept by the door, containing a few essentials: a flashlight, a bottle of water, some protein bars, a first aid kit, and a photo of her late husband, George. As she turned to flee, she saw him. Marmalade, her beloved ginger cat, was crouched under the kitchen table, his eyes wide with fear, his fur bristling. Marmalade! Relief flooded her, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. She knelt, reaching for him, but he hissed and backed away, terrified by the noise and the shaking house. The first wave hit. It wasn't the towering monster she'd seen approaching, but a powerful surge that slammed against the house, sending a shudder through the structure. Water began to seep under the door, cold and dark. Agnes knew she had to go. Now, Marmalade, come on, baby, she pleaded, her voice cracking. But the cat remained frozen, paralyzed by fear. With a sob, Agnes made the hardest decision of her life. She couldn't risk both their lives. She stood up, her heart breaking, and ran. She raced out the back door, into the howling wind and driving rain. The water was already ankle-deep, swirling around her legs. She headed for the highest point in her yard, a small knoll where an old oak tree stood sentinel. As she reached the tree, she looked back. The wave, the real wave, was upon her house. It crashed over the roof, engulfing the yellow clapboard in a maelstrom of water and debris. Agnes screamed, a wordless cry of anguish, as she watched her home, her life, everything she held dear, disappear beneath the churning sea. She clung to the oak tree, the rough bark digging into her hands, as the water rose higher, swirling around her waist, then her chest. She closed her eyes, praying for it to end, for the nightmare to be over. And then, as quickly as it began, the wave receded, leaving behind a trail of devastation and silence. Agnes opened her eyes, gasping for breath. The world was a wasteland of mud, debris, and shattered dreams. Her house was gone. And Marmalade was gone too. The Red Cross shelter, set up in the Seabreeze High School gymnasium, was a cacophony of noise and despair. Cots were lined up row upon row, filled with dazed survivors, their faces etched with shock and grief. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, instant coffee, and the underlying scent of fear. Agnes sat huddled on a cot, wrapped in a thin, scratchy blanket, feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. Her clothes were still damp, her body ached, and her heart felt like a shattered piece of glass. She hadn't spoken a word since being rescued, plucked from the oak tree by a young National Guardsman in a helicopter. A volunteer, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, approached her with a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Here you go, dear. Try to drink something." Agnes took the cup with trembling hands, but the coffee tasted like ash in her mouth. She set it down on the floor beside her cot. The volunteer knelt beside her. "Do you have any family we can contact?" Agnes shook her head slowly. George had been gone for 5 years now, and they'd never had children. Her only family had been Marmalade. My cat," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He was in the house." The volunteer's face softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, dear. So many people lost their pets. It's just awful." Agnes closed her eyes, tears squeezing out from beneath her eyelids. She pictured Marmalade, his soft ginger fur, his playful swats, the way he'd purr like a motor when she scratched him behind the ears. The image was so so real that it felt like a physical blow. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous routine of meals, medical checkups, and endless waiting. Agnes spent most of her time staring at the wall, lost in her grief. She listened to the stories of other survivors, tales of miraculous escapes and heartbreaking losses. Some had lost everything just like her. Others had managed to save a few precious belongings. But everyone had lost something. She made a few tentative attempts to connect with the other women in the shelter, sharing stories about George and their life together. There was Martha, a retired teacher who had lost her husband and her dog in the wave. There was Susan, a younger woman who was desperately searching for her 2 young children, who had been at school when the tsunami hit. And there was Emily, a stoic farmer's wife who had lost her entire livelihood, her farm washed away by the sea. They found solace in their shared grief, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of disaster. They shared stories, offered comfort, and cried together. But nothing could fill the void left by Marmalade's absence. Agnes tried to be practical. She filled out the necessary forms, applied for disaster relief, and listened patiently to the explanations of the various aid agencies. But her heart wasn't in it. All she could think about was Marmalade. Every day, she would walk to the edge of the designated safe zone, a perimeter established by the National Guard around the most devastated areas. She would stand there, staring at the wreckage, hoping against hope to see a flash of ginger fur, a familiar pair of yellow eyes. But there was nothing, just miles of mud, debris, and the skeletal remains of houses. The volunteers urged her to stay at the shelter, to rest and recover. But Agnes couldn't rest. She had to keep searching, even if it was futile. She owed it to Marmalade. He had been her constant companion, her furry shadow, for 15 years. He had seen her through George's illness and death, providing silent comfort and unconditional love. She couldn't just give up on him. One evening, as she sat on her cot, staring at the photo of George she'd managed to save, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days: determination. She couldn't bring back George. She couldn't rebuild her house overnight, but she could keep searching for Marmalade. She owed him that. She stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She would go back to her property tomorrow, she decided. She would search every inch of the wreckage, every pile of debris. She wouldn't give up until she knew, for sure, that Marmalade was gone. The first authorized return to the affected area was a somber affair. Residents were bussed in under strict supervision, allowed only a few hours to survey the damage and salvage what they could. Agnes, clutching her small emergency bag, stepped off the bus with a knot of dread in her stomach. The scene that greeted her was even more horrifying than she had imagined. Seabreeze, her quaint, picturesque hometown, was gone. In its place was a desolate landscape of mud, twisted metal, and splintered wood. The once familiar streets were unrecognizable, buried under layers of debris. The air was thick with the smell of salt, decay, and the faint, sickening odor of death. Agnes walked slowly, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She recognized the twisted remains of Mrs. Henderson's bakery, the collapsed roof of the town library, the shattered windows of the old hardware store. Every landmark, every familiar sight, was either gone or irreparably damaged. She followed the route to her property, her heart pounding in her chest. As she neared the spot where her house had once stood, she felt a wave of nausea. There was nothing left, just a muddy expanse, littered with debris. The oak tree, her only refuge during the tsunami, still stood, its branches stripped bare, its trunk scarred by the force of the wave. Agnes stood there, numb with shock, staring at the emptiness. It was as if her entire life had been erased. She felt a sob rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had to be strong. She had to search. She began to pick her way through the debris, calling Marmalade's name, her voice cracking with emotion. She lifted pieces of wood, overturned furniture, and shattered glass, her hands bleeding and raw. She searched under piles of rubble, in overturned cars, and among the tangled roots of uprooted trees. The other residents were engaged in similar searches, their faces grim, their movements slow and deliberate. Some were calling out the names of lost loved ones, both human and animal. Others were simply sifting through the wreckage, searching for anything salvageable, any memento of their former lives. Agnes found a few broken pieces of her china, a waterlogged photo album, and a tattered quilt that George had given her. She carefully placed them in her bag, tears streaming down her face. They were just things, but they were all she had left. She continued her search for Marmalade, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. She found other cats, some dead, some alive but injured, but none of them were her ginger boy. She helped a young woman rescue a terrified Siamese cat from a collapsed shed, and the small act of kindness brought her a fleeting moment of comfort. As the hours wore on, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the ruined landscape. The National Guard began to round up the residents, urging them to return to the buses. Agnes, exhausted and heartbroken, reluctantly obeyed. As she walked back to the bus, she looked back at the empty space where her house had once stood. The last rays of the sun illuminated the oak tree, casting a golden glow on its scarred trunk. Agnes felt a pang of despair so profound that it almost brought her to her knees. She had found nothing. Marmalade was gone. Weeks turned into a month, and the initial shock of the tsunami began to give way to a dull, persistent ache of loss. The Red Cross shelter remained open, but the number of residents had dwindled as people found temporary housing, moved in with relatives, or left Seabreeze altogether. Agnes was still there. She had nowhere else to go. Her insurance claim was being processed, but it would be months, perhaps years, before she received any compensation. And even then, it wouldn't be enough to rebuild her life. She had stopped going to the devastated area. The daily searches had yielded nothing, and the emotional toll was too great. She spent her days helping out at the shelter, sorting donations, assisting with meals, and offering a listening ear to the other survivors. She had formed a close bond with Martha, Susan, and Emily. They were her support system, her chosen family. They understood her grief, her loneliness, her sense of displacement. They shared stories, memories, and the occasional laugh, finding moments of light in the darkness. Susan, after weeks of agonizing uncertainty, had finally received confirmation that her 2 children had perished in the tsunami. The news had devastated her, but she had found a strange kind of peace in knowing. She was planning to move back east, to be closer to her parents. Martha had found a temporary apartment in a nearby town and was slowly starting to rebuild her life. She had adopted a small, scruffy terrier from the local animal shelter, a creature as lost and lonely as she was. Emily, ever the pragmatist, was working tirelessly to secure loans and grants to rebuild her farm. She was determined to return to the land, to replant her crops, and to restore her livelihood. Agnes admired their resilience, their strength in the face of adversity. But she couldn't seem to muster the same kind of energy. She felt like a ghost, drifting through the days, her heart heavy with sorrow. She still thought about Marmalade constantly. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for him on the cot beside her, only to find empty space. She would see ginger cats in the street, and her heart would leap with hope, only to be crushed when she realized it wasn't him. She had started to accept, reluctantly, that he was gone. It was the only way to survive, to move forward. She knew that he had likely perished in the tsunami, swept away by the force of the wave. It was a painful thought, but it was a reality she had to face. One evening, as she sat with Martha in the nearly empty gymnasium, she confessed her feelings of guilt. "I should have saved him," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I should have tried harder." Martha put a comforting arm around her. "Agnes, honey, you did everything you could. You couldn't have known what was going to happen. You can't blame yourself." "But I left him," Agnes whispered. "I left him to die." "You saved your own life," Martha said firmly. "And that's what Marmalade would have wanted. He loved you, Agnes. He wouldn't want you to suffer like this." Agnes knew that Martha was right, but the guilt still gnawed at her. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her cat. She felt like she had nothing left to live for. As the days passed, Agnes began to withdraw from the others. She spent more and more time alone, lost in her memories. She stopped eating regularly, and her already frail body became even thinner. She felt like she was fading away, disappearing into the shadows. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, a tiny detail that anyone else might have overlooked. But to Agnes, it was a spark of light in the overwhelming darkness. She had finally agreed to accompany Emily on a trip to the outskirts of the devastated area. Emily was checking on the progress of some preliminary cleanup efforts, and she had persuaded Agnes to come along, hoping that a change of scenery might do her good. They drove in Emily's battered pickup truck, the landscape slowly transitioning from the relative normalcy of the inland towns to the stark devastation of the coast. Agnes stared out the window, her gaze distant, her mind lost in the past. As they neared the area where Seabreeze had once stood, Emily slowed the truck. "I just want to check on something over here," she said, pointing towards a cluster of partially demolished buildings. "They're supposed to be clearing some of the debris from this access road." Agnes nodded absently, her attention barely engaged. She was used to Emily's practical, no-nonsense approach to life. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, Emily remained focused on the tasks at hand, on rebuilding, on moving forward. Agnes envied her that ability. Emily parked the truck near a pile of rubble, and they both got out. The air was still heavy with the smell of salt and decay, but the sounds of heavy machinery, bulldozers and excavators indicated that some progress was being made. Emily walked towards the access road, her eyes scanning the work area. Agnes remained by the truck, her gaze drifting aimlessly over the landscape. She noticed a small, overgrown patch of weeds and wildflowers that had somehow survived the devastation. It was a splash of color in the otherwise gray and brown landscape. As she looked closer, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A small, almost imperceptible movement in the weeds. She squinted, her eyes straining. It was hard to see, obscured by the tall grass and the dappled sunlight. Then, she saw it again. A flicker of orange. A tiny, almost invisible patch of ginger fur. Agnes felt a jolt of electricity run through her body. Couldn't be. It was impossible. But she took a tentative step towards the weeds, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marmalade?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The movement stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, a small, hesitant meow drifted through the air. Agnes felt her knees buckle. She stumbled forward, pushing her way through the tall weeds, her eyes fixed on the spot where she had seen the movement. And then, she saw him. He was smaller, thinner, his fur matted and dirty. But it was him, Marmalade. He was crouched low to the ground, his yellow eyes wide and wary, staring up at her. "Marmalade!" Agnes cried, her voice choked with emotion. She knelt down, reaching out to him, her hands trembling. He hesitated for a moment, sniffing the air, his whiskers twitching. Then, with a soft meow, he crept forward, rubbing his head against her outstretched hand. Agnes gathered him into her arms, burying her face in his fur, tears streaming down her cheeks. He purred, a weak, rumbling sound, but a purr nonetheless. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "Oh, Marmalade," she sobbed, clutching him tightly. "I thought I'd lost you. I thought you were gone." He licked her face, his rough tongue rasping against her skin. It was a gesture of affection, of reassurance, of love. Emily, who had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, approached them cautiously. "Agnes?" she said softly. "Is that?" Agnes looked up, her face radiant with joy. "It's him," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's Marmalade. He's alive." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "But how? How is that possible?" Agnes couldn't explain it. She didn't know how he had survived the tsunami, how he had managed to stay alive for all these weeks. It was a miracle, a gift from the universe. She held Marmalade close, stroking his fur, whispering words of comfort and love. He was weak and hungry, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. The discovery of Marmalade, or rather Marmalade's discovery of her, reignited a fire in Agnes that she thought had been extinguished forever. The apathy and despair that had consumed her for weeks vanished, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and determination. Marmalade was weak and dehydrated, his ribs showing prominently beneath his matted fur. Agnes immediately took him to the makeshift veterinary clinic that had been set up in the nearby town, where he was examined, treated for minor injuries, and given fluids. The vet, a young woman named Dr. Ramirez, was amazed by Marmalade's survival. "He's one lucky cat," she said, shaking her head. "To have survived that tsunami, and then to have fended for himself for so long, it's incredible." Agnes stayed by Marmalade's side, stroking his fur, whispering words of encouragement. He purred weakly, his eyes half closed, but he seemed to recognize her, to find comfort in her presence. Dr. Ramirez prescribed a special diet of soft food and supplements to help Marmalade regain his strength. She also advised Agnes to keep him indoors, at least for the time being, until he was fully recovered. Agnes returned to the Red Cross shelter with Marmalade cradled in her arms. The news of his miraculous return spread quickly, and she was greeted with cheers and applause. Martha, Susan, who was sighting before her move, and Emily were overjoyed, showering her with hugs and congratulations. Marmalade, despite his weakened state, seemed to bask in the attention. He purred contentedly as people petted him, marveling at his resilience. He became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, miracles can happen. Agnes set up a comfortable space for Marmalade on her cot, using blankets and towels to create a cozy nest. She fed him small portions of the special food, watching anxiously as he ate, slowly but steadily. Over the next few days, Marmalade began to show signs of improvement. He gained weight, his fur became less matted, and his eyes regained their sparkle. He started to explore the shelter cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. He even started to play, batting at a small ball of yarn that Agnes had found. But Agnes knew that she couldn't stay at the shelter forever. She needed to find a more permanent home for herself and Marmalade. Her insurance claim was still being processed, and it was unclear when or if she would be able to rebuild her house. She began to explore her options. She looked into temporary housing, contacted various aid agencies, and even considered moving in with Martha, who had offered her a spare room. But deep down, Agnes knew that she wanted to return to Seabreeze. She wanted to go back to the place where she had spent her entire life, the place where she had shared so many memories with George and Marmalade. She wanted to rebuild her life, not somewhere else, but on the very ground where it had been shattered. She started to make regular trips back to her property, accompanied by Martha or Emily. She cleared away more debris, salvaged a few more belongings, and started to envision what a new house might look like. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The area was still a wasteland, and the rebuilding process would be long and arduous. But she was no longer afraid. She had Marmalade back, and that gave her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. One day, as she was clearing debris near the oak tree, she found something that made her heart ache with a mixture of sadness and joy. It was Marmalade's favorite toy, a small, stuffed mouse that he used to carry around the house. It was waterlogged and torn, but it was still recognizable. Agnes clutched the toy to her chest, tears welling up in her eyes. She remembered the countless hours Marmalade had spent playing with that mouse, batting it around, pouncing on it, carrying it around like a prized possession. She knew then that she had made the right decision. She would rebuild her life in Seabreeze, not just for herself, but for Marmalade too. He deserved to have a home, a place where he could feel safe and loved. The new house was small, modest, but it was home. It stood on the same spot where the old house had once stood, overlooking the now calm Pacific. It wasn't the same, of course. Nothing could ever replace the memories and the history that had been washed away by the tsunami. But it was a fresh start, a new beginning. Agnes had chosen a simple, single-story design, with large windows to let in the light and a small porch where she could sit and watch the ocean. She had painted it a cheerful yellow, a tribute to her old home, and a symbol of hope and resilience. Marmalade, now fully recovered, explored his new surroundings with curiosity and delight. He rubbed against the furniture, sniffed the corners, and claimed the sunny spots on the floor as his own. He had a new scratching post, a new bed, and a whole collection of new toys, but he still seemed to prefer the old, tattered mouse that Agnes had found in the wreckage. The rebuilding of Seabreeze was a slow, gradual process. Many residents had left, unable or unwilling to return to the scene of such devastation. But those who remained were determined to rebuild their community, to create a new Seabreeze, stronger and more resilient than before. Agnes became an active member of the community, volunteering at the local food bank, helping with cleanup efforts, and offering support to her neighbors. She had found a new purpose in life, a new sense of belonging. Martha, Susan, and Emily remained her closest friends. They sighted often, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. They had all been through so much, but they had emerged from the darkness stronger, their bonds forged in the crucible of shared loss and survival. One evening, as Agnes sat on her porch with Marmalade curled up on her lap, watching the sunset over the Pacific, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The sky was a blaze of color, oranges, pinks, and purples, reflecting on the calm surface of the water. She stroked Marmalade's soft fur, listening to his contented purr. He was her constant companion, her furry shadow, her reminder of the enduring power of love. He had survived the impossible, and he had given her the strength to do the same. She thought about George, her late husband. She missed him terribly, but she knew that he would be proud of her, proud of how she had rebuilt her life, proud of how she had never given up hope. She thought about the tsunami, the devastation it had wrought, the lives it had taken. It was a tragedy that would forever be etched in her memory, a scar on her heart. But it had also taught her valuable lessons about resilience, about the importance of community, about the enduring power of the human spirit. She looked out at the ocean, the same ocean that had taken so much from her. But now she no longer saw it as a threat. She saw it as a source of beauty, of wonder, of life. It was a reminder that even after the darkest storms, the sun will always rise again. Agnes smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. She was home. She was safe. She was loved. And she had her ginger cat by her side. She had lost everything, but she had found something even more precious. The strength to rebuild, the courage to love again, and the unwavering hope for a brighter future. The resilience of an old woman, like the resilience of the coastline itself, was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a spirit mirrored in the unwavering yellow eyes of a cat named Marmalade.